Seventh graders, as promised, Chapter 5, Section 2 is up next. We are going to continuing to talk about Chapter 5 and the crisis that will emerge in the colonies. Our focus today is going to be on the topic of turmoil over taxation. And turmoil is going to refer to chaos, confusion, and eventually violence that will spill over in the American colonies over the issue of taxation. So Chapter 5, Section 2, turmoil over taxation. Before we look at the vocab terms, which 3 appear on the list here at the top of the reading, this vocab list is one of the largest of the school year. This list in Chapter 5, Section 2 includes 10 terms. They are all on the Quizlet site. They are all posted on your Google Classroom feed. Only 3 will appear here, but I want to just remind you guys that the 7 that don't appear formally at the top of the reading here, they are still vital to understanding what's going on in the colonies during this period of turmoil. So just bear in mind and be cognizant of the fact that there are 10 terms total. Only 3 are going to appear at the top of the reading. You still need to get familiar with the other ones by practicing and studying your Quizlet terms. 5 to 10 minutes a night per deck for each study deck that we're looking at each week. Let's look at the 3 that appear. We'll start with the term petition. Petition is a formal request to someone in authority that is signed by a group of people. A formal written request to someone in authority signed by a group of people. You have committee of correspondence. Committee of correspondence is a group whose members regularly wrote letters and pamphlets reporting on events in the colonies. So these committees of correspondence were basically writing letters and pamphlets pointing out what was going on in each of the 13 colonies during this period of turmoil. And lastly, we've got boycott. And a boycott is a refusal to buy certain goods and services. The term boycott means to refuse to buy certain goods and services. Just bear in mind, again, there are 7 other terms that relate to this section. The whole 10-term deck appear on Quizlet and on your Google Class page. Make sure that you're studying and giving yourself time. This deck is a long one, and there's a lot of terms that once you realize, or once you know them, and once you understand each of the terms and their definitions, it will help you, I think, much better understand what we're learning in class in Chapter 5, Section 2, over the turmoil over taxation. Now, after the French and Indian War ends in 1763, the British face new problems in North America. War's over. They've defeated France. The British have expanded their empire in North America, which for Britain and their point of view is a good thing, but problems are going to still remain and new problems are going to emerge. With the French gone, British colonists would begin to move west across the Appalachian Mountains in larger numbers. And on this frontier, British settlers, colonial settlers, are going to clash with Native Americans. They are going to clash. They're going to begin to encroach or to come into contact with Native American lands. And this frontier clash is going to result in battles with Native Americans. A series of clashes led by an Ottawa Indian chief named Pontiac became known as Pontiac's War. And in response, the British government issued the Proclamation of 1763. It's another one of your vocab terms that's highlighted. In the Proclamation of 1763, it really said 2 things. It said colonists could not move west of the Appalachian Mountains, and it also said that if you were west of the Appalachian Mountains and you were a colonist, you needed to go back east across the Appalachians and off of Native American lands. Okay, many colonists ignored this law and moved west anyway. So before we move on to the next paragraph, let's just kind of recap. the proclamation of 1763 said, it was a proclamation issued by the crown, by Parliament and the king, and it said that colonists after the French and Indian War are not to move west of the Appalachian Mountains and encroach on Indian territories. And it also said if you were already west of the Appalachian Mountains, you were to move back immediately. These laws were largely ignored by the colonists. And we're going to talk about in class how these laws would be easy really to ignore because these laws were issued from 3,000 miles away, and it is going to be very difficult for England. It is going to be very difficult for England and Parliament to enforce the laws with the mother country, England, being 3,000 miles away, separated by the Atlantic Ocean. Now, additionally, the French and Indian War had cost a great deal of money. War is expensive. War is expensive for soldiers' pay. War is expensive for loss of property and loss of equipment. War is expensive in terms of loss of life, probably most importantly, loss of life. Okay, the British government wanted the American colonists to contribute to the cost of the war that was just fought to really defend the colonists. French and Indian War was fought by Britain largely to defend the colonists from these Native American and these French attacks. And the British government wants the colonists to pay up. The British government wants the American colonists to pay for the costs of the war. So in order to do this, the British government is going to place new taxes on the colonies. New taxes, and when I say new taxes, I mean taxes that were not in effect before the war. These new taxes are designed to specifically pay for the costs of the recently completed French and Indian War. And the colonists are going to squawk at this because they don't think that they should have to pay new taxes that they have not paid before that. They think that and certainly the colonies do pay taxes. They pay taxes to their local governments. They pay taxes in the colonies in which they live. They are used to paying taxes, but the colonists are really going to object to being asked and being demanded to pay taxes that they had not paid before the French and Indian War. And again, these taxes are put into effect by England to help defray or to help pay for the cost of the recently completed war. The colonists argue that the taxes are unfair. They claim that since they did not elect representatives to the British government, since they did not elect representatives to the Parliament because they weren't able to choose their leaders living in North America, even though they were considered British citizens, even though colonists were still considered subjects and citizens of England, okay, they did not have the right to elect leaders in Parliament who were making laws. And therefore, if they did not have the right to choose their leaders or to vote for their leaders, they felt they did not have the right, or England did not have the right to tax them. Now, colonists, over to the other side of the reading, colonists would protest these taxes by holding demonstrations, writing petitions, forming committees of correspondence, and attacking tax collectors. Yes, attacking tax collectors. We'll talk specifically about some of the things that were done on this front in class. But yes, attacking tax collectors was some of the more violent ways that colonists would express their feelings on being taxed by Britain. They also joined together to boycott certain British goods. This was in response to these taxes. The colonists decided they were going to stop buying goods that were sent to the colonies, that were exported to the colonies from England. And a number of leaders played key roles in these protests. And we're going to take a look now at the chart below at some of these leaders. So looking at our chart, we've got colonial leaders. The title is Colonial Leaders in Protest Against British Policies, and it's going to go over 4 colonial leaders and what they did specifically to protest British tax policy. Samuel Adams from Massachusetts. Yes, Samuel Adams, the famous beer, is named after him. Samuel Adams worked behind the scenes to organize protests in Massachusetts. John Adams, another patriot from Massachusetts, used skills as a lawyer to argue for justice. We're going to talk more about John Adams as chapter 5 moves on. Mercy Otis Warren, okay? Mercy Otis Warren. Yes, Mercy Otis Warren is a lady. She is a female patriot. She wrote plays criticizing British officials. She wrote plays that criticized British officials, and she's one of the more celebrated women who were part of the opposition to British taxes and British policies as well. And finally, Patrick Henry was a patriot from Virginia who delivered fiery speeches that criticized British policies. Fiery speeches meaning very passionate and very inflamed and very, and many times controversial speeches that criticized British officials. These are some of the colonial leaders who protested against British policies. And finishing up the reading, we're going to talk briefly about the Boston Massacre. In Boston, last paragraph here, in Boston, where many citizens felt that they were being bullied into paying unjust taxes, tensions between colonists and soldiers led to the Boston Massacre, which we will spend a lot of time in class talking about after this reading. This occurred in 1770, March 5th of 1770 to be exact, and facing a large and angry crowd, British soldiers panicked and opened fire on colonists. 5 colonists were killed, and the Boston Massacre outraged the colonists, stirring up more anti-British feelings. And we're going to talk about the Boston Massacre and how this was used, this tragic event would be used by the colonists in Boston to help generate support among the other colonies besides Massachusetts, to help generate support among the other colonies in opposition to Britain and the British efforts to tax and to really manage the colonies from England. Now, let's take a peek at our questions that appear at the bottom of the reading. Question 1 is going to address specifically the Boston Massacre. What was a result of the Boston Massacre? What was a result from the Boston Massacre? Please take a moment, if you would, and answer that question referring to the reading. Question 2 is going to be related specifically to the chart, which we just spent a moment going over. Question 2, chart skills. What role did Samuel Adams play in colonial protests against the British? So you're going to go to the chart and you're going to look specifically at the role that Samuel Adams played in colonial protests against the British. Take a moment to do that. And when we return, our next lesson will address Chapter 5, Section 3, which will basically be titled From Protest, which we're talking about here in Chapter 5, 2, From Protest to Revolution. We're going to look at the start of the American Revolution, which is going to be the start of armed violence between colonial militia and colonial soldiers and British regular soldiers. That will be our next topic, Chapter 5, Section 3, From Protest to Revolution. Talk to you guys soon, and make sure you study your 10 vocab terms for this section on Quizlet.com. Also, they are posted on your Google Classroom page. Have a great day, guys.